It is my honor to introduce Dr. Gail Sinatra. And before I do that, briefly share the why behind the masterclass for those of you new to the masterclass series. The masterclass began last fall with Dean Noguera's vision with 3 goals in mind. First, to bring together the Rossier community of students, faculty, alumni, and staff to discuss topics that transcend our areas of specialization. 2, to stimulate discussions on topics that are central to the Rossier mission of advancing educational equity with the goal of provoking innovation and new opportunities for collaboration. And 3, to create opportunities for direct engagement and community building. We featured Dean Noguera and Dr. Imordino Yang on how education can advance the interests of humanity. This semester, we're excited to feature Dr. Gail Sinatra and Dr. Sean Harper on science denial and racism denial. We begin this masterclass series with Dr. Gail Sinatra, and with that, let me introduce her to you. If I were to do right by all of Dr. Sinatra's distinguished accomplishments, I don't think we'll be here to hear any of her talk. So I'm going to give you a much abbreviated version. Dr. Gail Sinatra, Dr. Gail M. Sinatra, is the Stephen H. Crocker Chair and Professor of Psychology and Education and Associate Dean for Research at the Rossier School of Education. She received her BS, MS, and PhD in psychology from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She is a fellow of both American Psychological Association and American Educational Research Association, and was recently elected to the National Academy of Education. Dr. Sinatra heads the Motivated Change Research Lab at USC, the mission of which is understanding the cognitive, motivational, and emotional processes that lead to attitude change, conceptual change, and successful STEM learning. Her co-authored book with Dr. Barbara Hofer, a psychologist of Middlebury College in Vermont, is entitled Science Denial, Why It Happens and What We Do About It, published by Oxford University Press. As you can see, even with the abbreviated introduction, she is kind of a big deal. And we are very fortunate to learn from her today. Please welcome Dr. Gail Sinatra.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Kathy, and thank you all for coming here to join us today. I really appreciate your time. This is my night to introduce the concepts of science denial. And soon, on February 8th, we're going to hear from Dr. Harper. He's going to get into the issues of racism denial. I want to note not only the date, but the change of venue. So if you're going to join us for the whole series, and I hope you do, because it's going to build on each week, please do join us over at the University Club.
Scriptorium.
Then we're going to bring together these topics of science and racism denial with a panel moderated by our dean, Dean Noguera. So that's a must attend. It's going to be awesome. And then I'm going to come back, and in this second lecture, I'm going to talk about the second half of my book, the What to Do About It. Tonight we're going to talk about what science denial is. And in this masterclass later in the semester, March 8th, also at the U Club, then we'll be talking about what to do about it. And then we will wrap up the whole series. So if you missed any of that, here's the whole series. We're going to wrap up the whole series with Dr. Harper again, also at the University Club Scriptorium on March 22nd. So I hope you join us for the whole series. But tonight, as Kathy said, we're going to talk about science denial. And I'm going to base my remarks tonight on the book I published last year with my co-author, pictured here with me, Dr. Barbara Hofer of Middlebury College in Vermont. And as Kathy said, the name of the book is Science Denial, Why It Happens and What to Do About It. Tonight we'll be talking about the first step, why it happens. I want to point out to all the students present and the students online that this book is available to you through the university library for free. Well, there you go, it's free. So just like you to know that. All right, so what difference does it make how we interpret science and enact policy? Well, here is a visualization of an enactment of science understanding actually drawn in the sand, a line drawn literally in the sand. This is a beach border between two counties in Florida, and they had different stay-at-home policies in April 2020, and everyone knows that's just when COVID really had taken off and people didn't really understand what was going on. And so this is a good visualization to see, how it is that understanding of science plays out and how it plays out differently depending on how you interpret it and what sense you make of it. This is something that played out writ large through COVID, through school closure policies, through mask wearing policies for businesses. Different interpretations led to different policies. So really, we all need to make informed decisions about scientific issues in our daily lives. And in our book, we talk about science denial, doubt, and resistance. So I'm going to go through what these really mean. So I'm going to start with what science denial is, and then we're going to go through what the doubt is and what the resistance is. And I really want to unpack this because a lot of people think there are science deniers as if it's a personality characteristic or a certain type of person, or as if it's other people. But we are all susceptible, because these are psychological processes that we employ. We are all susceptible to this. It is not an us or them issue. I'll start with science denial, which actually, full-on denial, is actually fairly rare compared to doubt and resistance. Denial is a belief-based stance and a rejection of evidence. This is when you stick with your beliefs despite evidence. So examples are climate change is a hoax. The earth is flat. Vaccines cause autism. But the more typical case that's a little bit more common than denial is actually cafeteria denial. And what cafeteria denial means is that what we all do, and believe you me, we all do it, I've even done it, everyone does it, is we tend to pick and choose. Just like when you're going through the cafeteria line, I'll have some of that, but I don't want that. And we pick and choose which science concepts and ideas that we like, and we tend to push aside those that don't fit with ideas that we're uncomfortable with. Finally, we have doubt and resistance, and this is very common and we all do it. We particularly doubt or resist ideas when they don't fit with our prior beliefs, when they conflict with our social identity, when they require a deeper analysis that we're not willing or able to do at that time, then you'll see more of the doubt and resistance coming in. Now, it's really important to understand that doubt can also be manufactured, and it can be manufactured by vested interest. This is an excellent book by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway called Merchants of Doubt. And this picture above is depicting the
tobacco industry executives who famously testified in front of Congress that cigarette smoking was not harmful to your health, even when they knew quite well at that time that it was. And instead, what they did, they manufactured this resistance, this doubt, and this denial about the true nature of smoking and its risks. And I think you will see that this is something that maybe Dr. Harper will talk about when you see this playing out with critical race theory, for example, where there is a manufactured fear of something that isn't really happening. So you might see this playbook play out in different ways, and we've certainly seen the merchants of doubt idea play out as a playbook for climate denial. In fact, they have really just used this as a model. It's used in all sorts of science denial, but I think it's also used in racism denial, and I'd love to see what Dr. Harper thinks about that. Now, I want to contrast doubt and resistance with skepticism, because skepticism is good, and it's healthy, and it's part of the scientific process, and we should be skeptical. So I read a study that postmenopausal women lose weight if they eat chocolate for breakfast, and I thought, awesome. But I was really, really susceptible to wanting to believe this and starting to think about what could I do to melt chocolate and put it on my toast in the morning. And then I looked at the study a little bit more, and it had less than 20 participants. It didn't have a control group. It was never replicated. And it was time for me to be skeptical of this finding. So skepticism is a good and healthy part of science, and it should be part of science. So be skeptical, but we will talk about instances where skepticism is less warranted. So then that brings the whole question of, should we trust science? There's an excellent book by, again, Naomi Oreskes, called Why Trust Science, and in that book, she outlines her explanation of why she thinks one should trust science. She says, well, science relies on empirical evidence, carefully collected, analyzed. Science builds on prior findings. It accumulates evidence over time. Science is a collective enterprise. It relies on peer review and expert vetting of ideas. But most important is, because science is conducted by human beings, and human beings are flawed, and human beings are biased, and human beings make mistakes, and all of those things we human beings do, science is far, far, far from infallible. However, she still argues, Naomi Oreskes argues, it's still worthy of trust because it's self-correcting over time. So I got to wait for more studies about chocolate for breakfast to see if that's really going to hold up. What we say in our book is, Barbara and I, say what we value, what we say we should value in education is the scientific attitude and the development of a scientific attitude. That's what we think is really valuable in education. What's a scientific attitude? According to Lee McIntyre, it's an openness to seek new evidence and a willingness to change one's mind in light of new evidence. And if we foster that in our students, that can be applied not only to science, but to all sorts of other topics throughout our life. All right, so now I'm on to what are some psychological explanations for science denial, doubt, and resistance? In our book, we talk about several, and I'm going to go over 5 of them tonight. We talk about social identity, mental shortcuts, epistemic cognition, motivated reasoning, and emotions and attitudes. And I'm going to start with social identity. So what we know from psychology about social identity is group membership influences our views of science. Individuals tend to conform to the attitudes of their group. We also know that in-group messages are much more persuasive than out-group messages, so people who are in your in-group that you perceive to be in your in-group are more influential. We also know that our sense of self is tied up in our social identity. So we also know that as we see information shared on social media, we check to see what our group thinks. If we identify with a particular group and that group questions vaccinations or questions mask wearing during a pandemic, that leads us to think, maybe I should question that too. We turned this on its head in a study we did a few years ago, where we actually said, well, wait a minute, you can leverage that. You can change who the in-group is in communications about science to be more influential. And we explored this in an area near and dear to my heart, which is water conservation. So what we did with my colleagues, Vivian Saranian, who's a social psychologist, and Morgan Polikoff, who helped us with this study as well, is we looked at in-group messages being more persuasive, so let's change the in-group. Anyone who has ever received a message at your home about how much water you use, you might recognize these messages. So they say, oh, you use this much water, but your neighbor uses this much water. And they're called comparative messages. These comparative messages are based on a knowledge deficit view. In other words, the idea is that if you just knew more about the conservation habits of yourself and your neighbors, well, then you would use less water. That's the theory behind that. We used social identity framing theory instead, and we said, no, we're going to change the in-group, and we're going to say to people, we Southern Californians, we care about water conservation. We conserve water. So we employed this, and we actually measured water, really measured water conservation and usage at homes. Ask me sometime how we did that. It was wild. And what we found was our in-group messages using social identity frames were much more persuasive. And people in that group, they used less water. We did this study in Pasadena in August. So I don't know if you know anything about Pasadena, but they like their lawns, and they use a lot of water, and August is pretty hot. And we actually showed a reduction. Whereas the knowledge deficit consumers, the high consumers who receive the knowledge deficit information, it backfired. Because they were like, oh, well, my neighbor's using a lot of water, I'm going to use a lot of water too. But if we work on changing people's frame of who is their in-group, then we can change how people view their social identity and how it changes who they resonate with. So, for example, if we're going to have conservation at our football games here at SC, which is, we're moving towards zero waste games, we're trying to do that, we would want to say, not you should conserve and be careful in your recycling and your trash at the games. We shouldn't say that. We should say instead, we Trojans, we recycle. Okay, but, big but, we get most of our messages about science through the digital world. We get most of our information through a digital media. And while science denial is hardly new, it is amplified now through social media. I mean, Galileo confronted science denial, but he didn't have a Twitter account. So today, what happens is we have information, misinformation, and disinformation spread broadly through social media about science. So how do we make sense of these claims? How do we decide what information to accept as valid? And it turns out we are much more likely to believe science articles that are posted by our friends on Facebook then are posted by expert sources. And this affects everyone because remember, we all live in a social media bubble. They're different bubbles, but we all live in a social media bubble. So as we start to just accept what our group thinks and what we see in our social media, this creates an erosion of trust in expertise, especially experts in science. But as mis- and disinformation spreaders have become so much more sophisticated, I don't know if you remember years and years ago, you would look at a website and you'd be like, oh, somebody made that up, that looks fake. Not today. As you research information online, misinformation spreaders, their websites are going to look really professionally done because they are professionally done. And it's really hard to assess the validity and the accuracy and potential biases of this information. I've written about this with my colleague, Doug Lombardi, and we say not only do you have to assess the validity and accuracy and bias of scientific information you read in online contexts, you have to judge the plausibility of that information. Is it really plausible? So I'm happy to say that my doctoral student, Imogen Herrick, has worked with Doug Lombardi and I to create instructional steps, 6 steps to sourcing scientific information. We just published this article about a week ago. And in it, we go through what are the steps you can teach your students to be better at sourcing scientific information online. And in lecture 2, in a few weeks, I'm going to go through this process with you and help you learn the steps to sourcing scientific information online and how you can teach that to your students. I also have a large National Science Foundation grant with Doug Lombardi and his colleagues to teach a large number of teachers these strategies, and we are going to introduce into that strategy something called lateral reading, which I'll talk to you about next time, which was developed by some Stanford professors, and we're going to introduce these different components to teachers, and they're going to teach their students, so I'll be able to tell you in about a year or so if we can improve these steps by expanding how we do this instruction through our research with National Science Foundation. All right, moving on to mental shortcuts. So we all have thinking and reasoning biases, and we all tend to rely on what's called System 1. System 1 is the quick, intuitive thinking. That's sort of our knee-jerk reactions, our gut feelings, and we do that more than we rely on System 2. System 2 is that deep, analytical, deliberative thinking. We don't do that all day long. We'd be exhausted. So we tend to use our System 1, this quick, intuitive thinking. But that can be very biased. Other biases that kick in are something called confirmation bias, where we seek out and interpret and recall information better if it aligns with our pre-existing beliefs. And the availability heuristic, one of my favorites, illustrated here by the senator from the great state of Oklahoma, who brought a snowball onto the Senate floor to prove that it was snowing in DC then, climate change can't be real. So that's called the availability heuristic. We believe information that's just available to us. So the snow had just happened, ergo, that must make it that it's climate change is a hoax. That was his argument. What can you do about that? My doctoral student, Laura Cookie, who's here with us today, and my colleagues over in psychology are exploring that. We're looking at what kinds of terminology we should and could use to promote more engagement, more interest, and more action from individuals who are receiving climate communications. We're looking at different terms, and we're seeing what kind of these System 1 reactions we get to the terms. And we're going to do this with a large national sample, representative sample of about 6,000 people. And we're looking at terms like climate change, climate emergency, climate crisis, and climate justice. And Laurel's analyzing that data. Even today we were talking about it, and it's really going to be interesting, so stay tuned. Next is epistemic cognition. What's epistemic cognition? Epistemic cognition influences our science understanding. I've written a lot about this over years with my co-author, Barbara Hofer. Epistemic cognition is how we think and reason about knowledge itself and knowing. Like, what is knowledge? How do we know what we know? What are our sources of knowledge, and why are those the right sources? And this totally influences our understanding of science. We use our epistemic cognition, our understanding of the nature of knowledge and knowing, to decide what counts as evidence, to resolve competing knowledge claims, to evaluate information critically, to integrate multiple sources of information, and to incorporate new knowledge into what we already know. My colleague Doug Lombardi and I have explored an instructional scaffold called the Model Evidence Link Diagram, we fondly refer to as the MEL. And in this, we have students compare two scientific models, Model A and Model B, where Model A is the scientific model, and Model B is a skeptic model. In this case, we used climate change and a climate skeptic model, increased solar radiation. We have students, this is middle school students we've done this with, we have students evaluate the evidence, this is actual scientific evidence, in this case 4 pieces of evidence, and they have to determine how does each piece of evidence relate to Model A, and how does each piece of evidence relate to Model B. And they do that by drawing these arrows. So it's an extensive intervention that takes weeks, but to sum it all up, they have to decide whether the evidence supports the model or strongly supports the model, contradicts the model, or doesn't have anything to do with the model. And what we find when we employ this instructional scaffold is that students are able to judge the veracity of the scientific model as greater than the skeptic model, and we look at the plausibility judgment. There's that word again. They view the scientific model as more plausible than the skeptic model. We have a lot of research on this, and I'll share some of it in more details in the second lecture. Lastly, there's an important aspect of epistemic cognition, and that's epistemic trust. This is really breaking down in our society right in front of us. Who do we trust? Who should we trust? What sources of knowledge should we trust? Should we trust experts? What experts should we trust? And we're finding that social identity, which we already talked about, strongly influences trust. So is Dr. Fauci a villain or a hero? It depends a lot on your social identity and what your social in-group feels and thinks. And I want to emphasize that there's a lot of reasons for distrust that are very legitimate, especially among communities that have been historically and currently mistreated by science and scientists. So when we talk about vaccine hesitance, we have to break that down intersectionally, because there are some groups that have good reasons to be concerned about their treatment in the scientific community, because historically it has not been equitable. And so when we look at scientific trust, we have to really look at it much more intersectionally, who's trusting who and why. Next up, motivated reasoning. So you've probably all heard about motivated reasoning. This is when our motivations bias our understandings. We decide what evidence to accept as valid based on the conclusions we prefer. And again, we all do this, and sometimes we don't know we're doing it. Usually we don't know we're doing it. Research has shown that individuals are much more critical of the methodology of a research study if they don't like the outcome. And again, identity plays out. As we look at people's identities, That enters into how they view and reason about scientific evidence. I've looked at this a lot, again with my colleague Barbara Hofer, and we've looked at different types of motivations and how they influence scientific reasoning. And here's a few of them. Social identity, it's coming back again. Cognitive biases, we've already talked about that. Vested interest, do you have any money on the line? Or other types of interests, political, for example. And what are your motives from an epistemic standpoint? So social identity, as I've said, if your group is a science hesitant, maybe you're science hesitant. So you think, I'm a conservative. Conservatives are hesitant or reject climate change, then maybe I should too. Vested interest. It's interesting to note that countries with the highest GDP have lower acceptance rates of climate change. Wonder what that's about. Cognitive biases. We just saw how snowmageddon is one of those types of cognitive biases reflected by the availability heuristic. And then epistemic motives. So epistemic motives are things like need for closure and comfort with ambiguity. Lots of people are not comfortable with ambiguity. For example, climate modeling is never 100% accurate because modeling, by definition, is not 100% accurate. We can't predict the future with 100% accuracy. So climate models have a degree of ambiguity. Some people are uncomfortable with that. Ergo, they say, oh, the climate models, well, they're wrong, they don't know. Attitudes and emotions are next. So I've looked a lot in my career at conceptual knowledge about science. What do people know about science? What do they understand accurately? What do they misunderstand? What kind of misconceptions do they have about scientific content? But a really interesting look is to look at the intersection of knowledge and attitudes. So we've done that with my colleague Vivian Saranian, the social psychologist, and we've said, well, you can have an accurate conception about a particular scientific topic, or you can have a misconception. And then you can either be sort of pro or con attitudinally. So attitudes are your valenced feelings towards a particular topic. So that leaves you with these four groups. So you might have an accurate conception and a positive attitude. So for example, with climate change, you might think that humans are contributing to climate change and you're in favor of climate change mitigation initiatives. You also might understand accurately that humans are contributing to climate change, but you may be against any climate change initiatives. Maybe you think that they're too expensive. Maybe you don't want to change your lifestyle. Maybe you think, don't worry, technology will save us. That's very popular right now. You may have a misconception, however, about the nature of climate change and humans' contribution. Maybe you think it's all kinds of pollution. It's not all kinds of pollution. It's pollution that contributes to CO2 rise. So maybe you have this misconception, but you're still pro-climate change initiatives. Well, the problem here is you might be willing to vote for certain initiatives but not others based on your misunderstanding. For example, cleaning up the side of the road is great, and so you're for that, but maybe you don't understand that it's really about CO2, which is really about fossil fuels, and so maybe you won't be voting for all the right policies if you don't really understand. And then we have this last profile, which is misconceptions and negative attitudes, what my students like to call low-hanging fruit. So this is where you are thinking that climate change is not caused by humans, and you're against climate change initiatives. And the reason why we like this group is because when we can correct misconceptions by the kinds of instructions we talked about earlier, persuasive communications or this instructional scaffold we talked about, we have found we can shift attitudes as well. So correct the misconception first, and the attitude can shift. And that's why we like to address people in that box because we feel we can get a lot of change out of that. In addition to attitudes, we know that science is deeply embedded with our emotions. If you came to the masterclass series last semester and listened to Dr. Mary Helen E. Modino Yang, you know that we learn through and with our emotions. And so what can we do to promote science learning and leverage the emotions that students have in a positive way to get that interest? Well, along with Fred Frecking, who's here today, and a lot of my other colleagues in Rossier, we created a set of lessons called speedometry, which had students playing with Hot Wheels cars and trucks. And what we did was we just took that natural love of play and we embedded that into the science curriculum, and wonderful outcomes occurred in science learning. So we're trying to do that the same thing right now at La Brea Tar Pits. If you've never been to La Brea Tar Pits, you should go. It's here in Los Angeles, and it's a very interesting place. We are building 2 augmented reality exhibits at La Brea. And next time I'm actually going to share all of that with you. We have the AR, we're going to share that with you. We're going to go through all of that next time when we get deeper into instruction next time. We're looking at whether the AR technology facilitates learning of science content and creates interest. What surprised people? How did they shift their knowledge? We've created this first experience we call Pit 91, where participants see a virtual bubbling pit of asphalt, and they discover fossils, send them to the lab to be identified, and the fossils help them understand what the environment of Ice Age Los Angeles looks like. In this second field experience, they're out literally on the field, and the participants see an entrapment scene. So they see life-size mammals, such as mammoths, saber-toothed cats, direwolves, walk right past them. It's incredibly engrossing. As we were collecting data, we had to follow our participants around so they didn't bump into stuff because they were so immersed. I had to follow one guy around. I thought he was going to fall into a tar pit. So what happens is they get really engrossed and they see an entrapment scene. They see how these animals became entrapped in tar. So here we are leveraging, again, emotions to help people understand their own environment. This is a place-based intervention here in Los Angeles, and I'm going to tell you a lot about it next time, so stay tuned. Leaving a lot of fun stuff for next time in case you haven't noticed. All right, so these are some of the things we talk about in our book, but given that I lived in Vegas for 10 years, a little less conversation, a little more action. What can you do about these things? Well, in our book, we have recommendations for individuals, educators, policymakers, and science communicators. What can individuals do? You can cultivate a scientific attitude. We talked about what that is. You can nurture that appreciation in yourself and others. We can improve search skills. I told you about that grant where we're teaching people how to evaluate scientific information they find online. You can start to become aware of your own cognitive biases. Instead of relying on system 1, you can step back, rely on system 2, and think, oh, is chocolate really the answer to my breakfast challenge? Maybe I should think about what are my motivations there? I think it might be that I like chocolate. Maybe I should wait for more evidence. You can listen to others in an open and curious way. We encourage people to think carefully about what other people are saying when you have conversations, maybe over Thanksgiving dinner, about the Flat Earth Society with your cousin. You can vote for those who value, support, fund science, and who base their policy decisions on evidence. What can educators do? We can all enhance our own science understanding. We should teach about the nature of science. I think I'd get an amen from Fred up there on that one. How does science know what it knows? What doesn't science know, and why doesn't it know it? Why did everything evolve during the novel coronavirus, where first we didn't wear masks, and then we were supposed to wear masks, and then we were supposed to wear a different kind of mask? Were those scientists just making things up, or were they changing their decision-making based on new evidence as it came in? If we had a better understanding of how nature evolves and the nature of science, we might have understood those shifts in decisions and policies a little bit better. Obviously, we should foster scientific thinking in all students, not just students who are going to go into STEM careers, but scientific thinking helps you when you're trying to problem solve and reason about other topics, not just science. We can teach real-world applications of science. When we teach using that speedometry lesson, we asked kids, what did they want to explore about the Hot Wheels cars and tracks? What did they want to know? Let students ask questions about science that they care about, that are meaningful and important to them. And then let students choose their own areas of inquiry. What is it that they want to explore? We all know that choice is a motivator. Be aware that everyone has strong beliefs, attitudes, and identities that enter in how they feel about science. I used to teach in Utah and a long time ago, and there are students who have very strong beliefs that entered into their understanding of human evolution. You have to be aware of that and be sensitive to people's beliefs. And recognize that students' emotions, as we said, that we learn through and with them. We often think we don't want emotions in the classroom, but as Dr. Imedina Yang explained, that's not only not a good idea, it's not possible. So we want to work with students' emotions to help them learn. And then we must foster digital scientific literacy. There's a lot of misinformation out there. Students need help figuring out how to find reliable, accurate information. If you ask students to Google, did dinosaurs and humans live at the same time? It'll say, yeah, they did. That'll come up because of algorithms. Algorithms push misinformation to the top, not accurate information. What can science communicators do? Write about science for the general public. Write about how scientists know as much as they do and what they don't know. And know the audiences that you're communicating to and their likely misconceptions and motivations, their attitudes, their emotions, and their identities. You want to provide evidence for your scientific claims. Why is it that someone is saying this as a scientific finding? It's not enough to show the finding. You need to show the evidence. And both sidesism is a disaster for science. That's for opinions. There's not two sides to our current view of climate change. There's just the scientific evidence. What can policymakers do? Hire and listen to science advisors. We used to do that. We don't do that as much anymore. And base policy on empirical evidence. Support standards in education that emphasize how to think. We spend a lot of time on what to think, but how to think is very important. We need to push back on this current trend of ignoring factual evidence and demand rigorous standards for our teacher preparations. We need to teach more science to our teachers. They often tell me that they feel very unprepared to teach science, particularly in elementary. And press social media to be more responsible and transparent and accountable. And as I say that, as both Facebook and Twitter have decided to go the opposite direction just recently. Thank you. Next time we will share our next topic with Dr. Harper, and then we'll be back talking to you again with Dean Nogara, and then I'll be back to go over some more of these instructional interventions in more detail in the future. And now I'd like to take some questions. please use the microphone because we have people who are online and they won't be able to hear you unless you use the microphone.
Thanks so much. It was a great talk. My name's Barbara Christie, and I graduated from Sierra. I've spent a lot of time teaching science, and I've taught science classes here to students in pedagogy. My question is, I totally agree with you on how to improve the K through 6 or education on science, but how do you have any way to do that? Because most teachers maybe take a biology class in college, but they never really take a curriculum-based science course if they're not secondary science teachers.
So that's an excellent question. If you look internationally at countries that do a little bit of a better job, in my view, of infusing science through teacher preparation, teachers are required to take more science than we require teachers to take. So particularly in elementary. There's a lot that's in a teacher preparation program. It's hard to fit everything in they need. They need so many different topics, but I have teachers when I go out into elementary schools tell me that they don't teach science because they don't feel qualified to. They don't feel prepared to. They don't feel like they know enough about science to do it. And so many teachers want more science background and they want to be better prepared. And when you think about where we're heading in our research, we're heading into climate change education, and what we're finding out, Laurel and I, is that there's a lot of teachers who want to teach about climate change but don't really know how. It's complicated and they want more information. So we need to better prepare teachers to be able to confront these challenges.
Can I just add on? Nobody jumped up to ask a question. How about specific science teachers bringing what we do to secondary education into the, because many private schools do that. Private schools such as Center for Early Education have a specific science teacher. They have specific labs. And then secondly, in New York, when they have the region exams, they require laboratory equipment in order to take exams, and that is a great equalizer, because then in even low-income areas, they have equipment because they have to be able to have the equipment to take the exams. So can you kind of speak on that?
Yeah, I think it's at all levels, right? It's standards, it's teacher preparation. I think it really starts with teacher preparation and what we expect and require of teachers, and it's teacher PD in service, and then it's a change in standards and policies and certifications. So it's a wholesale approach that would be needed to be able to do a better job. So it's kind of ironic. Science has gotten much more sophisticated and much more detailed and nuanced in recent years, and yet we teach less about it. So we're not preparing ourselves as educators, and we're not able to therefore prepare our students to be able to deal with complex systemic issues like climate change.
Greetings, my name is Marion Arnaghi. I'm a postdoc in the Police Center for Higher Ed. I'm really struck by, really the intersection between science denial and racism denial. In particular, raising the point that you made about historical and current mistreatment by science and scientists. As me being who I am, I'm interested in kind of the business of knowledge production and the ways it's contorted and institutionalized to really reciprocate or perpetuate scientific harm is what I hear. So how do you correct or atone for scientific harms that are baked into institutions, institutional practice when it comes to teaching scientists to be scientists? I'm thinking of socialization. When you have like these realities of Black peoples in society who time after time evidence has showed we do not have a higher tolerance of pain, but that is still something that is ignored consistently. So I guess I'm thinking of the implications of like who is doing the shifting and the correcting of misconceptions when those misconceptions are institutionalized.
That is an excellent question. It is imperative that we encourage more K through 12 science learning so that those students can go on to be scientists. We have to diversify science in order for science to begin to deliver in a fair and equitable way. When you look at medicine, for example, there were very few women doctors, how many years ago? Biology today is actually predominantly female, and more women are entering medical professions than men. And what's happened in that shift is that we now very well understand that symptoms of heart attacks from women are completely different than the symptoms of heart attacks, for men, which wasn't even looked at or understood before. So you can't correct those inequities, I don't think, without diversifying who's doing the science, because as we prepare students to enter science, those people who have different questions and get to ask those different questions will explore that, and we will find out these more nuanced things. But you point out a real challenge, and that is, it's not about belonging in STEM, it's about being welcomed into STEM. It's about being ready to, prepare students in STEM and wanting a diverse set of students in STEM. And that's the disconnect that you're so pointing out to. And I would recommend our own Julie Passalt's book on equity in STEM. That's an outstanding book that deals directly with these issues, and I hope Dr. Harper will extend that in his conversations in this. But that's the rub. If we don't start early and get these students prepared, we're not going to be able to get them in, but it's from both ends, because we have to change the nature of science to be more welcoming and inclusive, or you can get in, but who's going to stay if you're mistreated once you're in? So it's a complex issue from both K-12 and higher education.
I do have a question from online. It says, you mentioned being sensitive of individuals' beliefs which may be incompatible or contradictory with science. Are these not the individuals we should most challenge to engage in scientific thinking and evaluation?
Yeah, I've done a lot of work on evolution understanding with teaching Christian students about evolution with my colleagues Sarah Brownell and Elizabeth Barnes. And what they do is they work with scientists who are Christians, and they bring these people back to identity and in-group messaging. They bring these scientists to their classes and talk to students directly about their faith as individuals and their practice as scientists. And when Christian students see that there are scientists who look like them and have beliefs like them, they're much more understanding of evolution, they're much more accepting of scientific views of evolution, and they're much more likely to enter biology as a career. We've also seen, sadly, the opposite, reflecting a little bit of the question we just had. When Liz Barnes was here working with me, she observed, sadly, a class here, this was years ago, and she found that the professor of this particular biology class was dismissive of students who raised questions about their own faith and the intersection of their own faith and their beliefs and how science goes. So it can go two ways. You can be dismissive and turn students off, or you can meet students where they are and connect to them in their community. And there are plenty of faith-based scientists. Look at Katharine Hayhoe, who's a Christian, evangelical, and one of the top climate scientists in the United States. There's examples of that in evolution. There's examples of that in other fields of science. So I think you have to be accepting of students and who they are, and you have to show students that many, many scientists are people of faith and have no difficulty doing that. And there's a lot of good books by those people that explain their feelings and their science and how they reconcile those things for themselves. And I think those examples are really compelling for students.
We have one more question that did come in. It says, do we have to wait for future generations to solve these problems? What do we do to transform policies and practices now?
There's so much you can do right now. There's actions that you can take every day that make a difference, for example, in taking climate action. One of the things that we find is in psychology is there's a lot of climate anxiety. People, young people in particular, are very concerned about their future. We see these devastating storms getting more severe. We see our coastlines eroding. So we see these fires in California, and they're really concerned and anxious. But we've also seen that psychology is showing that taking action and being climate advocates and working in your community, there's so many opportunities to do that. And we find when young people take actions, either individual actions or advocacy actions or community actions, it reduces their own climate anxiety. So it ends up being a helpful thing for their community and for themselves personally. And there's lots of resources for individuals to get involved. Dr. Harper.
Dr. Sinatra, this was a fantastic lecture. Thank you for kicking off the series. It's such a pleasure to partner with you on this. Have you traced historically the erosion of truth around science? I remember from one of your slides that you pointed out that this isn't new, but has there been perhaps an intensification of the science denial over time?
That's a really good question, and we get that question, Barbara and I, all the time. It's really, really hard to answer, because if you look historically, like if you want to go way back, Galileo, right? What happened to those who were advancing science at that time, right? So obviously it was a very small group of people who were, accepting of science. So if you look at it from that perspective, you have much more science acceptance now, right? But then if you look like, the Sputnik error, that spurred this tremendous, probably for the wrong reasons, interest in science because we wanted to be competitive. Wasn't the right reason, but it did spur a tremendous interest in science, and this sort of the space race created all this interest in science. So if you look at that era, I would say enthusiasm and interest and excitement about science was at a high. And then I think where we are right now is the explosion of mis and disinformation on the internet, which of course it was exacerbated because everybody was shut down during COVID. So COVID misinformation, and everybody's sitting at home and they're scrolling through Facebook and they're taking ivermectin. And we see people, my nephew is an infectious disease doctor, and he has sat with people in his care who died saying, I have lung cancer. And he was like, no, you don't. You have COVID. No, you don't. You have COVID. No, I don't. I have lung cancer. And then they die. So they would literally die in his arms saying, I don't have COVID. That's not a thing. I mean, where does that come from? So that kind of intensification of denial is definitely coming from the intensification of us splitting into these groups where we're determining reality based on our community and what our community thinks, not based on evidence. And that has definitely been exploding over the last few years.
Can we give Dr. Gail Sinatra another round of applause? Thank you so much. We learned so much, and we want to thank you, and we look forward to seeing all of you at our next masterclass on February 8th.
Thank you.
Thank you.